included today in all our understandings, even in the field of psychotherapy, and this is psychotherapy focused on addictions, whether related to alcohol or to other conditions. We're looking more and more also of encouraging people to connect more with nature and with the natural world, rather than being over-confined to our homes and watching a lot of television or watching a lot of videos or movies or things like that. The need to go outdoor. That has been one of the disappointments for me in the medical advice we've been getting here in Europe around the coronavirus, particularly in the early stages where so much emphasis was being put on people staying in their own homes and staying indoors. I heard very few comments to the effect, go out, get plenty of good fresh air, even if it's only within the vicinity of your home. That connection with nature and with the natural world, I think, is very healing and very empowering for all of us in a range of different ways. Another question that was put to me around the whole notion of prayer related to healing. Now, in the book that I showed you on the screen by Lynn McTaggart, The Intention Experiment, she has a very interesting chapter in that book on the power of prayer for healing. Some of you may be familiar with the name of Bernie Siegel, a well-known heart surgeon in the United States who has now retired. And he was reputed for saying to a family or to the loved ones of a particular patient, I'll be doing the heart surgery on your brother at 2 o'clock next Tuesday afternoon. Please take the afternoon off and be in solidarity with me, sending prayerful energy my way. And he believed that that did make and would make a significant contribution to a more positive outcome. In the chapter that Lynn McTaggart has in her book, she does talk about the power of prayer to send healing towards others. Indeed, we can do the same thing to send healing towards the damaged parts of our planet and our creation. And then she cites a number of experiments that show that indeed does happen, but also one or two very interesting experiments. One of them being where a contemplative community was praying for a particular outcome for a certain person, and the outcome didn't happen. And one or two examples along those lines. One of the conclusions that one of the suggestions that she was making was that when we are praying for a good outcome for another person or for a group of persons, that we always need to leave the prayer open also to the reality of the wider universe. And what she's suggesting, that maybe in that particular example, that they were too focused, too explicit on the particular outcome that they wanted for that person. And that was almost like they weren't allowing the healing energy of the wider creation to do the work. So in other words, our prayer is a prayer with, rather than just a prayer for, is one way of looking at that. Again, I think there are a number of useful web pages where you can read some further information on this. One questioner was asking, what exactly is photon energy? I think the easiest answer to that is that vitality that's at the heart of every communication, even the communication of desire, of thought, of reflection, of aspiration. And it's also part of the mystery that's inherent to the meaning of energy. Maybe if I tell this short story, it will help to the person who asked that question to give another perspective on it. This is a story told to me by a sister in the United States who was studying there. She was from Sri Lanka. And during her time there, she developed some form of cancer and was put on a treatment for chemotherapy as her treatment. She had on the window in her room 3 or 4 small plants. On this particular day, she noticed that all the plants were drooping. They had kind of lost some of their vitality. So she went to the local garden shop, and the gardener recommended some treatments for the plants, and he gave her some of these energy boosting materials. None of them would make any difference. And yet the plants were not dying. And then about 6 weeks later, or maybe 6 or 8 weeks later probably, one day she walked into her room and the plants were back to their normal, healthy condition. And as she began sharing the story with friends, they helped her to begin making the connections. She started the chemotherapy on a Tuesday. The plants began to wilt on a Friday. She finished the chemotherapy on a Tuesday, and the plants began coming back to normal the following Friday. Now, please, any of you that may be on chemotherapy or on radium therapy or some other treatments, don't jump immediately and say, I must get off this. But it is a fascinating story, that one, that there was something in the medication that she was taking, which did, as far as I know, help to bring her back to good health, was somehow disrupting the overall flow of energy within the room and impacting negatively upon the plants. The lesson in all this, which is really, I suppose, about, we're talking about quantum physics here, really, and we're talking about microbiology and other very fine sciences, is that energy, on the one hand, is an incredibly rich, textured, complex reality, and yet it's something that touches the lives and hearts of every one of us. And we're forever using it. And I think the more awareness we can begin to bring to how we use it, it's not so much awareness about what it is, because that's going into the whole scientific complexity, but maybe just being aware of that every word is energy, every desire is energy. And so, for example, sometimes when I sit in groups of particularly Catholics, and we begin criticizing what the local pastor is doing or not doing, or what Rome is doing or not doing, or what a particular bishop is doing or not doing, I find myself often wondering, are we putting out negative energy? We're desiring something good, yes, but is there a great danger that that negative energy we're putting out is actually exacerbating or making more entrenched and difficult the very thing we want to change? So instead of criticizing whether it's Donald Trump or whether it's the bishop or the pope or whatever it is, maybe to ask ourselves, could I redirect this energy maybe around questions like, how could we empower the people of God to become more proactive in living out their faith today? That's a more positive, proactive kind of statement. Now, there are times, of course, where a meaningful critique is very important in helping to change things and to help to move things forward. But I think, yeah, maybe those two words are the clue to that question. To be very vigilant when I'm in a reactive mode. I think that can be counterproductive a lot of the time. How can I help myself and help others to move from that into a proactive mode? That, I think, is what we're touching into. I think energy is a wonderful gift to which we always need to bring, when possible, the proactive dimension of ourselves, and to be much more vigilant around our negative reactions, which at the end of the day, even though they're humanly understandable, possibly does not do a great deal for either ourselves or anybody else. There's one wonderful question here. Well, all the questions are good, but this one in which the person is asking about recent science suggesting that what goes on in our brains just doesn't belong to the brains, but to the whole of our bodies. And that is absolutely spot on. Yes. I think we have overemphasized the role of the brain, and that comes from our Western way of thinking. And indeed, much of that is in Christianity, going back to the ancient Greeks, that over associate rationality with the head. And then they began to equate the mind with the brain, whereas in fact, the mind is in the whole body. It's not just in the brain. In fact, if the mind is primarily located somewhere within us, it's probably more in the entire nervous system, we think. So mind should never be equated with brain. And then brain, particularly in the light of some of the new science that I talked very briefly about, and the brain being programmed for relationality, it's probably better to think of brain as a process rather than a particular part of us. And that there are certain things activated in the head area of ourselves, but they won't go anywhere. They can't achieve anything on their own by staying in our heads. It's when they flow to the rest of the body in what we call process, then that's how things are happening. So the intelligence of the body is not just in the head. The intelligence is spread throughout the entire body. But then very importantly, remember, stretch your hands out the full length, those circles, that's the body too. Because without those energy fields, we would not even exist. So this physical configuration is possible in all its goodness, in all its beauty, in all its struggle, thanks to what these wider energy fields provide for us. So that's brain as well, but perhaps better called mind, or what today we call mindfulness. I was asked to say a bit more on heaven, hell, and purgatory in another one of the questions. A few weeks back, we celebrated the Feast of the Ascension, which is a very strange kind of feast to have these days in our understanding of the modern world. And some people can feel a bit shocked when they hear this being said first. But I think any of us that are more at home in this emerging story of our universe can understand it. We need to remember that Luke, and he's the only one that has an explicit story of the Ascension. He has it at the end of his gospel. He has it in the first chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. And Luke was writing, he says in his letter, in his gospel, and in the Acts of the Apostles, "O Theophilus." And Theophilus is generally understood as being a fairly high-ranking philosophical person. So Luke, it seems, was writing his gospel very much with that kind of intelligentsia in mind. Now, Luke has a lot of beautiful stuff too around the poor, and some good stuff on women, although that's controversial nowadays. So writing these two letters keeping in mind particularly this man, Theophilus, who would be of Greek background and very wedded to Greek philosophy. For the Greeks, there was a three-tier universe. The heavens above, Hades beneath, which we wrongly equate with hell, because it was more a kind of a nebulous, vague place where nothing much happened, and the earth in between. That's what's called the three-tier universe, which unfortunately Christianity has held on to and still holds on to in many situations today. In the new cosmology, in the new story, in quantum physics, there is one world. There is not a three-tier universe. There never was. And there never, well, there certainly won't be in the foreseeable future. So therefore, then Luke comes along in his story of the, so what's happening then in the Gospels, operating out of the three-tier universe, which some people claim does not belong to the Hebrew mind at all. It belongs to the Greek. So Jesus dies. After his death, it's assumed he went up to the heaven in the three-tier universe. In the resurrection, although it's a different kind of embodied expression, he's back on the earth. And so Luke and his followers, and maybe this man Theophilus is asking, so we must get him out now again to get him back up to heaven. So Luke creates the story of the Ascension. It's a story. It should never be taken literally. Now, we can understand it today metaphorically or symbolically about the ubiquity or the overall presence of God in the whole creation. That's one way we can understand it metaphorically. So my reason for saying all that, when we talk about heaven, hell, purgatory, those kind of notions come out of this idea of a three-tiered universe, which does not exist. It doesn't make any sense. Therefore, our beloved, after their journey through this life, heaven, hell, purgatory, if they have any meaning, they're states of being within the one creation. Our dead are all around us. They're right in here, living and acting out of a different energy level. And that energy level is not in some distant place called heaven. It's part of the whole creation. I'm just doing a quick check to see if there's any other questions at the moment. Somebody says, if you read the late Candace Pert's book, Molecules and Emotion, yeah, she describes a lot of what I'm talking about, absolutely. Okay, I think I'm going to hold it there for now. Thanks for those questions. And as I've already said, feel free to keep contributing as we go along. Now, I need to get reconnected in terms of my PowerPoint presentation. Share the screen. Okay, and slideshow. Okay, Bridget, or somebody there can tell me if the images are up and people can see things?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, thank you. So, in terms of the handouts, friends, and if you didn't already get those handouts, Diane will send them on to you in due course. This is the second page called The Breath of the Spirit. And what you're looking at the screen is my own book, published by Orbis. In the beginning was the Spirit. So let's go straight into this material, and then I want to make several connections here with your questions, as well as with some of the issues confronting us at this time of the coronavirus crisis. So the first slide I'm showing you is the quotation on the page. Primal peoples respect nature because they see it as a manifestation of spirit. And since they see themselves as manifestations of spirit too, they feel a sense of kinship and connection with nature, a sense of sharing identity with it, which contrasts with the sense of otherness to the natural world which we normally experience. Primal peoples see themselves as custodians of the land, looking after it on behalf of the Great Spirit. Primal peoples are what in Canada and the United States you call First Nations peoples. In parts of Africa and other parts of the world, they might call them tribal peoples. My interest in this subject began about 30 years ago when I had the privilege, thanks to some of the sisters in Australia, of doing a short piece of field work with the Australian Aborigines. And then thanks to the Maris brothers, about 2 years later in New Zealand, I had the opportunity to do some work with the Maori people. Over the years, I have met a number of First Nations groups in the United States and Canada. I've had the opportunity of connecting with some tribal groups in Africa and some of the mountain peoples of the Philippines and Taiwan. In all cases, and I began to notice this at a very early stage, they use this phrase, the Great Spirit. It was obvious that this was their way of naming God. But it took me several years to realize the nuances with which they use that naming. And then that's what eventually brought me to write the book. So in the quotation you have, which is from a man called Steve Taylor, who is a British sociologist. For our First Nations peoples, spirit is experienced, and experience is the right word here, through the land. That should not be confused with pantheism or anything like that. In other words, they don't have this idea of the spirit being a transcendent entity that belongs to the reality of God above and beyond this created world. No, for them, the land, creation itself, it's like the umbilical cord that links them with life. That's all important to realize that. But that's their understanding. Once we begin to glimpse that, then we get into some of the huge consequences. Meanwhile, this quotation from Laudato Si, simply to share it with you. It is essential to show special care for indigenous communities and their cultural traditions. For them, land is not a commodity, but rather a gift from God. Very, very important, that sentence. And from their ancestors who rest there. A sacred space with which they need to interact if they are to maintain their identity and their values. Now, we come then to the crucial slide, which is number 2 on your page. So you don't need to write this down. That therefore, for our First Nations peoples, it's our earthiness that's the vital clue to our holiness. And this is a major challenge for Christians all over the world, because the earlier understanding of Christianity, you know, in that first image I gave you in the last session, we're down at the bottom of the triangle. We're kind of caught in the web of our earthiness. God is up above the sky, the three-tier universe. And if you like, the spiritual life in that old understanding was forever trying to drag us up so that we become one with God outside this creation. Our First Nations peoples never had that understanding, and they never had anything like it. In fact, their understanding is probably the earliest and the oldest we have on how human beings have understood what today we call God. And therefore, I feel we have an enormous amount to learn from them, and I find it deeply saddening. I know of very few theologians who as yet are making themselves acquainted with this material or beginning to integrate it with their theology. Leonardo Boff of South America has written a wonderful book, Come Holy Spirit, published by Orbis, and in which he integrates the theology of the Holy Spirit with both quantum physics and the new story, the new cosmology. One of the first books to ever do that so explicitly. But sadly, he says virtually nothing about our First Nations peoples. And so the material I'm now sharing with you is still very new, and we yet have to do homework on it to begin to integrate it. Therefore, in the understanding of our First Nations peoples, it's our earthiness that constitutes our primary identity. The baby does not come into the world, it comes out of the world. We're all born out of that matrix, that energetic matrix, which is creation. And the primary source of that energizing potential is what traditionally we have called the Holy Spirit, and what our First Nations peoples call the Great Spirit. Therefore, our earthiness defines the context of our belonging. And therefore, if our friends in China were taking that seriously, instead of looking at the bats and the birds and the animals as objects to be traded and to be commercialized and consumed and so forth, they would need to begin looking at, there's a web of belonging here. How do we honor that? How do we respect it? How do we work with it? Third point, it's our earthiness that illuminates our sacredness. Therefore, our sacredness is not something that belongs primarily to the heavens, to that place above the sky, which doesn't exist and never existed. Our sacredness is in the deeper interweaving and integrating, journeying with the reality of our earthly conditions. It is the formative womb of our becoming. Now, I'm kind of repeating myself here. That's the whole idea that we come out of the world. We don't just come into it. It's the recycling web to which everything returns, and in which, strictly speaking, nothing is wasted. Now, in that process of the recycling and dealing with the waste, there is destruction. And I'll be coming to that in one of my presentations tomorrow. That's what we call the great paradox. We leave that for the moment. And then finally, our earthiness is the home in which our ultimate meaning is embedded. We are created as earthlings, and it's in our identity and uniqueness as earthlings that we grow into that fuller sense of life, which we call flourishing. In the words of John's Gospel, I've come that they may have life and have it to the full, except we need to understand that not just about humans, but about all forms of life. Lovely quotation here from Elizabeth Johnson from her book, Ask the Beasts. Neglect of the spirit and of the religious value of the natural world seem to go hand in hand. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, moving on. So then some of the names around the different parts of the world for the Great Spirit. The Lakota people in the United States call the Great Spirit Wakantanka. The Hopi people call it Masu, and a range of the other peoples have their different names for it. In Polynesia, they call it Mana, as they do in New Zealand. In New Guinea, it's called a Munu. For our African people, Kawot, among the newer peoples, the Mabuti call it Pipo. In South America, Ekiko is the Andean Great Spirit God, and Makanaima is a name that's used in a range of different places in South America for the Great Spirit. The fascinating thing for me is many of these peoples have never even communicated with each other, never mind meet each other. And yet, they all have a very similar understanding of what we call God. There's something quite profound going on here. It seems a shame that theologians and others haven't given it attention much earlier on. In West Africa, they have this notion of the Jaya Nyame. You can put that word or that name into your Google search boxes and you'll get a little bit more information. And it's often put like this. In its native African translation, it means no one lives who saw its beginning, and no one will live to see its end except God. And it's an image used by Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Ghana, in Sierra Leone, and in a number of other West African countries. I think what's being referred to there is the Great Spirit, even though they're not naming it explicitly as such. Therefore, Great Spirit is living spirit, energizes the energy of creation, permeates everything, and embraces all, persons and non-persons alike. So I'm now coming back to the definition of spirituality earlier on, this link with energy. So let's have a quick look at this in the next slide. This is a very quick lesson on quantum physics. Kept very simple. God's presence in creation is that of creative energy, chi in Asian cosmology. And so a more careful reading of the book of Genesis highlights this point. Verse 1, the Spirit drawing forth order, drawing forth creative potential from the chaos. The first naming of God in the book of Genesis is not the Father creator, but the Spirit. The Father can only create in the power of the Spirit. The Spirit comes first. Hence the title of my book, In the Beginning Was the Spirit. That has all sorts of implications. And I suppose maybe because they're so vast, maybe that's one of the reasons why a lot of theologians are so reluctant to go there. But they will have to eventually. Energy, all energy is energized by the inspiring Spirit of God. Inspiring, inspirited. If that being the case, whereas mainline physics claims that energy is random until we humans do something with it, if we work with this assumption that all energy is energized by this divine great Spirit, then there is no such thing as random energy. All energy is connected. All energy has purpose. If energy ends up being destructive, and once again, we're back to the coronavirus, it's because something has interrupted the generic, natural and supernatural here mean the same thing, the generic, natural flow of the energy. Therefore, the disruption, which then results in so much chaos, is not God's problem, it's our problem. I remember reading about 6 scientific reports of Katrina down in New Orleans, going back whenever it was, some years back. And all 6 agreed on the same thing in the final paragraphs of their articles, that in the United States, as elsewhere in the world, we have had some of these erratic weather patterns for many, many years. But for the greater part, we humans learn to cope with them. In more recent years, they're much more fierce and ferocious and destructive. Why? And all 6 articles in the last 1 or 2 paragraphs said the same thing. Because we humans are now interfering or intercepting in ways that are creating balances in the upper atmosphere of life. This is what is giving, at least in part, this extra ferocity and destructive potential to these storms. So even what we call freaks of nature, we humans may have to come to terms with the fact that it's we're who are causing the freakish elements and not just the natural elements themselves. Number 3, the Spirit empowers all creativity. So now this word creativity is coming in. And that includes what we might call the primordial creative power in the Christian scriptures and in the scriptures of other religions too. The power of the Creator to create itself belongs to the Spirit. And therefore, Catherine Keller, one of the American theologians who I find quite an inspiring woman, she says, instead of talking about creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing, which is a statement used to kind of protect the super autonomy of God the Father, that there was nothing there before he decided to create. She says, instead of using that phrase, it would be much more responsible to use the phrase ex profundis, the Spirit who creates from the profound depths of the energy of all creation. So these are just some of the major theological implications emerging here. Number 4, the Spirit infuses the desire to relate. By the way, this material, sorry I should have said it, is number 3 on your page. It's all there in number 3 on your page. So this capacity for relating is how we embrace the energy, how we internalize the energy, how we work creatively with the energy. All energy is interconnected, as Pope Francis says in Laudato Si. The Spirit as unit of being is an idea from an old British theologian of some years back. St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, the Spirit reaches the depth of everything, even the depths of God. The Spirit comes first. And therefore, in people, the Spirit gives priority to the transpersonal. So people often say to me, as they may have said to some of yourselves, all this talk about the new story, the new cosmology, quantum physics is wonderful and it's inspiring, but it's very impersonal. I pray to a personal God. Now, this distinction between the personal and the impersonal is a dualism. It's what we call dualistic splitting. Think of trying to build a bridge across those two. That's what we call the transpersonal. Another meaning of the transpersonal, I can only become the full creature that God desires me to become in and through my connectedness with everything else in creation. I'm going to repeat that. That's what the transpersonal really means. In Jungian psychology, they call it the process of individuation. I can only become the fuller being to which I'm being continuously called to become in and through a more integrated interconnection with everything in creation. That's what's meant by the transpersonal. Just to, again, make the connections with science and to encourage people not to be so fearful about science, which many people are, unfortunately. That's because of the way we've been taught in our schools, I think. Albert Einstein, everybody who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science become convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of humankind, and one in the face of which, with our modest powers, we must feel humble. What an amazing statement from a guy that called himself an agnostic. Maybe every good theologian should become an agnostic now and again. And then Max Planck, who is one of the founding fathers of quantum physics. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particle of an atom to vibration and holds the most minute solar system of the atom together. What is that creative energy that brings things into being and holds everything together? I think he's talking about the Great Spirit. And our beloved Elizabeth Johnson, this is from her book, Creation on the Cross. God's Spirit breathes the world into being, dwells in all things, quickens love into flame, inspires the prophets, and renews the face of the earth. Now, I usually tell 2 or 3 stories in this presentation. Today, I'm going to keep it to one. This is a parable of the Great Spirit. And I believe if Jesus was around today, these are the kind of parables he would be telling. This is Lawrence Anthony, a very wealthy business broker in South Africa who died in 2012. He had a deep love for animals all his life. And several years ago, a breed of elephants started becoming very destructive around South Africa, breaking into people's homes at night and doing a lot of damage. The South African government of the day decided they would exterminate them. This man intervened. He had a big range of land in an eastern part of South Africa. And he asked the government, please give me these wild rogue elephants. I think I might be able to tame them. And in that case, we won't have to destroy them all. And the government agreed. And he did a remarkable job, forming an incredible relationship with these animals, and came to be known as the Elephant Whisperer, which is the title of the book you see there on the screen. He came to kind of international fame in 2001 when Iraq was attacked for the second time by the Western forces, America, Britain, and France. And one of the first things in the bombing that they did, unfortunately, they destroyed the zoo, left it in a terrible mess in Baghdad. He was absolutely horrified, got some friends from South Africa, all at his own expense, got on an airplane and flew out to Baghdad, right into the middle of the war zone. And amazingly, got Iraqis and American service people all working together with him to restore the zoo, which they did. It took about 6 months. He died of a heart attack in 2012, and then this is what happens, as you see now on the screen. For 12 hours, 2 herds of wild South African elephants slowly made their way through Zululand bush until they reached the house of the late Lawrence Anthony, the conservationist who saved their lives. The formerly violent rogue elephants, destined to be shot a few years ago as pests, were rescued and rehabilitated by Anthony, who had grown up in the bush and was known as the Elephant Whisperer. They had not visited the house for a year and a half, 18 months. For 2 days, they loitered at Anthony's rural compound on the vast Tula Game Reserve in South Africa, Kuala Lumpur, to say goodbye to the man they loved. The first herd arrived on Sunday, the day after he died, and the second herd a day later. They all hung around for about 2 hours before making their way back into the bush. And then wait, there's more to this. On the anniversary of his death, this is according to one of his sons, on both 2013 and 2014, a group of elephants visited his home place and stayed around for a number of hours on the day of his death, the exact day. To my mind, that's the Great Spirit at work. That's a parable of the Great Spirit. What an amazing, liberating, empowering understanding of God, away from so much of the patriarchal stuff that has been weighing us down for so many centuries across all the religions, unfortunately. Okay, so on your page, you have these these 2 quotations, which I'm going to go through rather quickly. I'm now repeating myself, but it's valuable to hear these ideas being spoken to by other people, in this case, Elizabeth Johnson. A creator spirit dwells at the heart of the natural world, graciously energizing its evolution from within, compassionately holding all creatures in their finitude and death, and drawing the world forward towards an unimaginable future. Through the vast sweep of cosmic and biological evolution, the spirit embraces the material root of life and its endless new potential, empowering the cosmic process from within. So the interiority that we have long associated with our personal spiritual journeys, we now need to try and understand that interiority and internalize it, not merely in terms of humans, but in terms of all the other creatures and the ecological reality of life itself all around us. The universe in turn is self-organizing and self-transcending, energized from the spiraling galaxies in the double helix of the DNA molecule by the dance of divine vivifying power. Vivifying, vitalizing, energizing. It's a very loaded statement. You have it on your page. I think after our work today, it may be one of the quotations that you could valuably take away and prayerfully sit with. And then my second quotation is from another American, Mark Wallace, from his book, Fragments of the Spirit, published back in 2002. And he says, at the behest of the Spirit, it is time for a reversal of this convenient hierarchy. Rather than placing nature at our disposal, it is now the natural world itself, in all its power and poverty, its grandeur and fragility, that disposes us to interact with it as equal co co-partners. See, that's not how our mega corporations look at life. That's not how the people in China look at their dealings with the birds and the bats and the animals, nor the peoples in other parts of the world that are into cloning from animal parts and so forth, or even the exploitation of animals at times in medicine. So that we need to look at them as equal co-partners. The Spirit is calling us, he says, to become friends of the earth rather than merely stewards of its resources. I have proposed a shift in emphasis towards a biocentric redefinition of the Spirit as God's agent of interdependence and unity within all creation. And once again, it saddens me that in saying that, he doesn't make an immediate connection with the Great Spirit, because that's exactly what our indigenous peoples have been saying for many, many years. And so, friends, I come then to the final point, and there'll be a bit of time then for you to formulate some questions before we'll have a concluding prayer. So the key points are down at the end of your page, and some of the key conclusions arising from this session. Number one, sacredness has neither beginning nor end. Sacredness is. There is no such thing as a secular entity anywhere in our world. Everything is potentially sacred. Can you imagine what life might begin to look like when we use that as a starting point? That is the starting point of our indigenous peoples. Sadly today, because many of them too are being influenced by modern influences, even some of themselves have lost sight of that incredibly profound, basic reality. Secondly, ultimate mystery is intimately near. That speaks for itself, I think. Number three, our earthiness is the medium that connects us with the divine, in and through the power of the Spirit. And you have heard me repeat that statement several times already today in the first session and particularly in this session. Number four, we don't worship the Great Spirit, we co-create with it. Now, this is a very interesting point and one from which I think, again, we have an enormous amount to learn. Our whole concept of worship would change dramatically if we did begin with the Great Spirit and try to integrate this wisdom. So our First Nations peoples, they do have a lot of very impressive rituals. Yes, they do. But they use the rituals not to pray to or to pacify the Great Spirit, but to co-create with the Great Spirit. In other words, they use the rituals so that they may become more disposed to receive of the wisdom of the Great Spirit. And that understanding of worship and prayer is very close to what Paul says in the letter to the Romans. It's not we who pray, it's the Spirit of God who prays in us. Prayer is not about actions or words or deeds. Prayer is primarily a disposition of receptivity. A disposition of receptivity. Of course, we use words and formulas, but that is our need, and that's fine as long as we acknowledge that it's our need. We feel we're doing something and doing it right when we use the words or the structures of the formulas, but that is not the heart of prayer, either understood from St. Paul or understood against this background. The heart of prayer is in the receptive disposition to this great mystery of the Great Spirit, within which, to quote St. Paul, we live and move and have our being. This is a really important point coming from the tradition of our First Nations peoples. And I'll come back to it in a moment when I talk about prayer. Next point, ethics and morality is about relating rightly with all creation. Now, sometimes today, and with some justification perhaps, some of our First Nations peoples are criticized for their dabbling in drugs and in other rather reckless behaviors, which unfortunately they have appropriated because of the impact of the wider cultures on them. And maybe at times because of the things that we and our governments have done, by the way, we have so marginalized them. And the kind of dismissive statements sometimes made, you'll find in literature, is, oh yeah, these people, they're all about creation and they love creation, but they have no sense of personal morality. That's a very unfair judgment. I think some of these issues they struggle with, as many other people struggle with too, need to be seen within a context. There is a sense, yeah, their primary sense of morality and ethics is certainly related to the right use of the land and the right use of the resources of the land. But they do also have personal criteria in their morality and way of living. And then finally, prayer is about expressing spirit, not about addressing God. Now that statement is a kind of a paraphrase of a statement taken from Martin Buber, the great Jewish mystic. That prayer is about, in prayer, we're not about addressing God, we're expressing God, is the way he puts it. So prayer, therefore, is an articulation of that inner connectedness with this reality we call the Spirit, mediated for us and experienced in and through the living earth itself. So these are my 6 conclusions. There are obviously many others. And so the context for this input then is that when we talk about spirituality, and that strong emphasis on spirituality as a new way of relating, and relating with the wider web and the wider reality of creation, this inherited wisdom from our Indigenous First Nations peoples around the world is an enormous contribution that can be so enriching, so supportive, and so affirming of us in this spiritual journey and its challenges in the times of which we're living. Okay, what I'm now suggesting, I'm going to leave 5 minutes of silence, of quiet, and during that time, people may want to formulate some questions or comments, and you can put them on the chat box. I'll probably have time to respond to 1 or 2 because I want to allow a final 5 or 6 minutes for a concluding prayer. And we'll also have a breakout session in a breakout time in our session this afternoon, and you may want to talk with each other about some of these issues. So 5 minutes of silence, just to jot things down for yourself. Maybe this is just for yourself, and that's fine. Or if you want to type up a statement or a question for me on the chat box, feel free to do that for 5 minutes.
I don't think 5 minutes is long enough to call her. I'll wait till I. Oh, it didn't help.
Is this Chicago Corral? Is that Mary?
Yeah.
Okay, friends, I'm going to return, and there are some wonderful questions coming up, some of which I will respond to in the later session in the afternoon. Very quick comment on a few of them. St. Francis, was he the first theologian of the Great Spirit, or at least a significant one? Yes, he was. But let me also add, so were several of the female mystics of the Middle Ages. Hildegard of Bingen, Meltig of Magdeborough, Julian of Norwich. There was a whole number of them. St. Francis is the one that we probably know most about. Two questions about where does Jesus and the Christian story fit into all this. We will be dealing with that tomorrow. And then one question, very good comment. I've referred several times to the markets in Wuhan. What about the farming practices, the poultry practices, and a range of others that we use extensively in the West? Yeah, indeed, there's a range of issues there to which the very same principles would apply, that we need to look at and revisit. In other words, our justice and our ethics from here on, in the light of this pandemic, can no longer be confined to human beings. We have got to bring in all the other creatures that share the web of life with us and include them in our ethical approach, in our spirituality, and when we talk about justice. So I will come back to some of the other questions or comments, as I've said. And in the session now this afternoon, I'm going to look at what we call the great paradox. Where does suffering, where does the dark side, where does the shadow side come into all these ideas? I'm not dismissing that or ignoring it. Neither does the great story. So that's what I'll come back to. But I'm going to end the session for now and hand over to Kathy for a concluding time of prayer and reflection. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, Diarmuid.
Thank you.
I'm just going to invite us as a group to feel our feet on the ground and to give ourselves a breath, and recognizing as we give ourselves a breath, it is the breath of God breathing in us and with us. And just settle into that. Inhaling and exhaling into your body. Resting in the great spirit that dwells in you and around you. Feel your feet on the ground and open to that earth energy that is coming into you to support you, to give life to you. And now I invite you to feel into the 120 of us gathered here on this call. As Diarmuid said, we have many layers of energy around our physical body. And so imagine that energy field reaching across the miles, across the ocean, around the planet. Send your loving energy to every friend and yet to be friend on this call. And open your heart to receive the energy that is being sent to you in return. It is through relationship that we know God. And so feel into this relationship. This experience of spirit within, among, and between us. And lastly, I invite you to hold in this energy field all that is aching and hurting and in need of healing in our world. And so we sing.
This energy abounding is something quite astounding, a wonderful sensation, alive in all creation. So come, it's a love song, inviting us to sing along. Look, listen, feel, this energy is real, and it's here, and it's near, and it's love. This energy abounding is something quite astounding, a wonderful sensation, alive in all creation. So come, it's a love song, inviting us to sing along. Look, listen, feel, this energy is real, and it's here, and it's near, and it's love.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Diarmuid, for a wonderful morning. And I invite us to, we gave you a long period of time this afternoon. You have 2.5 hours before you're invited back on Zoom. As I mentioned, if possible, you might keep the Zoom room open to make it easier for you to reconnect this afternoon. But our hope is that during this time, in addition to having lunch, you find some space for self-care, for moving around, because it can be a little draining to be on technology all day. But we also invite you to maybe take a bit of time for contemplation. We had a lot of wonderful information that was given to us this morning. And so just some time to let it sink in, be absorbed in your heart and your mind and your body. And lastly, we're keeping the room open for those extroverts in the group who would like an experience of community. The room is open for gathering. Thank you. And we'll see
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Thank you, Diarmuid.
Thank
What
you.
time do we return, Bridget?
2:30 Chicago time.
Thank you.
See you later.
All right. See you later.
I'll see you later.
Thank you, Diarmuid. It was wonderful.
It's a wonderful
Okay,
morning.
thank you. Thank you.